this afternoon and evening. I am going to tell two stories today. That's really part of my stock in trade at RSSB, I suppose, is to help try to keep the corporate memory alive. And one of the best ways I think we can do that is by telling stories. One of the stories in particular has become pertinent yet again, and I'll come to that as we get to that point in the story. But without further ado, I'll gladly take questions after these two stories, of course. But I'm going to get straight into it, and hopefully, if you can tell me if you can see my screen there, hopefully you can.
Yep, I can see it.
Splendid. No need to see me, though. Wayne Murphy's slides are much more engaging than my face. So without further ado, in that case, I will make a start. If there are any problems with the reception, do give me a shout and we'll try to sort it out. But otherwise, have a listen, see what you think, and as I say, I'll happily take any questions at the end. Waiting. That's the lot of the driver when the signal ahead is red. Waiting in a loop for an express to pass by. Waiting in a yard for the off. Red means danger. It also means safe. As we all know, red signals warn drivers of points set against them, obstructions up ahead, and of course, other trains. As we also know, if a driver passes a signal at danger, if there's a spad, an accident can occur. It happened at Slough in 1900. It happened at Norton Fitzwarren in 1940. It happened at Slough and Ladbroke Grove at the latter end of the last century. But what if a red signal actually shows green? It should be impossible. It is very rare, yet it can happen, as the events of the 12th of December 1988 were to prove all too clearly. Back then, when work was well underway on the redevelopment of Liverpool Street, when the East Coast Main Line was being electrified, when there was increasing productivity, more stations, rising passenger numbers, falling subsidies, it seemed that sectorisation, the division of British Rail into 5 separate business units, was working. It seemed that the golden age for rail might just be dawning. It was around this time, amidst this spirit of improvement, that re-signalling schemes had also been commissioned or completed at Brighton, Newcastle, York, Leeds, Leicester and Waterloo. The last was a particularly big operation, involving the replacement of equipment on the busiest stretch of railway in Britain. On the evening of the 27th of November 1988, an overtired, undertrained technician left a bare wire in the relay room at Clapham Junction A. You can see it there, top left, a huge signal box on a gantry that spanned a sea of lines at the station throat. 2 weeks later, further work jolted the wire, causing it to touch a terminal, make a connection, and prevent a signal from returning to danger after the passage of a train. Just after 8 a.m. on Monday, the 12th of December, a commuter service was heading for the cutting where that signal stood. On board, the crowded, cowed passengers were deep in conversation, deep in their morning papers, novels, thoughts. Green light followed green light, the usual story, except the last one should have been red. As the train rounded the curve into the cutting, its driver saw another blocking the line ahead. He applied the emergency brake, but it was too late. The collision forced the leading coach to the side, where it struck an empty unit passing on the opposite line, killing conversations, thoughts, and 35 people. 35 killed and almost 500 injured. If you've seen one of my older presentations from quite a long time ago now, you might have heard me mention Polmont. Polmont, where a lightweight driving trailer struck a cow and came off. Polmont, in which 13 people were killed in 1984. Yet Polmont was nothing like Clapham, whose death toll was worsened by the fact that the displaced carriages had nowhere to go, hemmed in as they were by the empty stock on one side and a retaining wall on the other. The chairman of BR at the time, Sir Robert Reid, visited the crash site and accepted full responsibility on behalf of the organisation. If you've read George Muir's biography of Reid, he also did accept some personal responsibility as well. He knew there was much to be done, but within a few months, the questions some had raised on the eve of sectorisation about standards, staff cuts and chains of command would come up again when 2 fatal spads occurred in just 3 days, at Purley on the 4th of March 1989 and Belgrove on the 6th. The impact of Clapham was especially profound as the railway had been enjoying a period of improved safety. Yes, there'd been some major incidents, but people were starting to believe that accidents on the scale of Hither Green and Harrow and Wealdstone were part of the past now. If you agree with what Stanley Hall wrote in Hidden Dangers, a book I recommend, it was odd that Clapham was subjected to a public inquiry. The Tay Bridge disaster had been the first because the railway inspectorate had been involved in the bridge's approval. Over 70 people had been killed by its collapse on the 28th of December 1879. Hickson had been the next, the RI having been involved in the approval process for automatic half-barrier crossings, which had played a large part in the collision that killed 11 people at the start of 1968. Did the Secretary of State for Transport at the time bow to media pressure over Clapham? Probably, but that wasn't the whole story. In fact, the RI had been overseeing the Waterloo Area Resignaling Scheme, as it was called, only partially, although the role it had, or should have had, was confused by unworkable legislation. It hadn't helped matters by producing ambiguous guidance as to what sort of schemes needed approval. So, arguably, it was in a difficult position. Arguably, then, a public inquiry it had to be. And chaired by Sir Anthony Hidden QC, that inquiry also looked at common issues that arose from Purley and from Belgrove. One of the things it did was ensure that risk management and change management went on to play a vital part in our decision-making processes. We combat complacency with continued vigilance. Arguably, BR at that time was complacent because it had not been continuously vigilant. In fact, in reorganising for sectorisation, it had bled, just like Jerry Fines had warned 20 years before. The famous quotation from that book, which I also recommend, "When you reorganise, you bleed," is quite interesting. Fines wrote that in 1967. He was quoting his trainer of some 20 years before, and his trainer was quoting Petronius, which suggests to me that as a species we are not particularly good at dealing with organisational change. But I think the lesson is that if you know that already, you can confront it head on and you can do something to try to tackle it. Back to 1988, and the Southern Region's S&T department had been veritably turned upside down, and its chief had spent most of the previous year agonising about it. As Hidden would write, the appearance of a proper regard for safety was not the reality. Working practices, supervision of staff, the testing of new works failed to live up to the concept of safety. They were not safe. They were the opposite. The cause of the wrong side signal failure behind Clapham was revealed to have been a series of errors. In brief, the end of the wire in question should have been trimmed and insulated. The other end should have been disconnected. The accident would not have happened if either precaution had been taken. These errors or omissions were made by a signalling technician whom I described earlier as overtired and undertrained. Hidden records that it was all down to a combination of characteristic errors of poor working practices that should have been picked up by proper supervision and uncharacteristic errors that had arisen from constant repetitive work and excessive levels of overtime, both of which, quote unquote, had blunted his working edge. And to be more explicit, the technician had had 1 day off in the previous 13 weeks. And you won't find this in the public inquiry report, the Hidden report, but in British Rail's internal report, there was also a small baby at home, suggesting that the quality of sleep that the technician was getting wasn't going to be of the best either. Among the Hidden report's many recommendations was one to ensure that overtime is monitored so that no individual is working excessive levels of overtime. This led to the development of criteria for what was considered acceptable levels of working, known as Hidden 18 after the recommendation number, and a process to monitor it. Fatigue management has developed even more since then, of course, and in fact we now have a whole new guidance on managing the risk from fatigue. It's a key part in leading health and safety on Britain's railway, the agreed signed up for health and safety strategy that the railway runs and RSSB facilitates, and there are a number of cross-sector groups that focus on strategy. But as I was once told, one still hears the phrase, do you want to pay your mortgage or do you want a break? So there are pockets of this problem still there, and you will see fatigue in the causal chains of a number of RAIB reports still today. So it's something we can never lose our grip on, I think. For breaching the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act, the British Railways Board was fined £250,000 at the time. That's equivalent to about 495 today, although I think the figure would be rather more than that today. There was some frustration at the time that there was no prosecution for manslaughter. However, Clapham was a catalyst for change, in that in 1996 it was one of the events that led the Law Commission to form the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act of 2007. Back on the railway, new processes and instructions were introduced regarding the installation and testing of signalling works, including the development of those two handbooks there. Regarding safety culture, it was recommended that British Rail continue to press ahead with its Total Quality Management Initiative and the application of British Standard BS 5750. Originally termed Organising for Quality, this effectively ceased when the industry was privatised, and it took quite a long time for us to get back to something like that position. As to the SPAD situation, Clapham, or rather Purley and Belgrove, also helped us down the path towards automatic train protection, or its more cost-effective variant, TPWS, which, like ATP, also improves on the automatic warning system, AWS, by automatically applying the brakes on a train that has passed a fitted signal at danger, or is approaching one too fast. And as I'm sure we all know, it has successfully helped put SPAD risk down to levels lower than could once have been imagined. And of course, TPWS is merely one in a long line of safety improvements, from the adoption of lock, block and brake by 1900 to the increasing mechanisation that has helped train accident fatalities fall since 1950. And it certainly won't be the last, not in an industry where staff retire, move on or move in from elsewhere, and where the human element still sits alongside technologies old and new. For this reason, the railway will go on monitoring trends, go on innovating, keep remembering the lessons of the past and keep sharing those of the present, until the future means it no longer needs to. But let's not get complacent. Yes, that word again. For over the Christmas period of 2016, extensive track and remodelling work, resignaling work, was being carried out in and around Cardiff Central. Some of the new layout was brought into use on the 29th of December. At 08:37 that day, the driver of a Treherbert service noticed that the points his train was about to take were not in the correct position. He stopped the train just before reaching them, and here's Simon French, then Chief Inspector of RAIB, who said that this alarming incident serves as a timely reminder of how easily things can go wrong when railway infrastructure is being upgraded and renewed. It is important, he went on, when organising intensive periods of commissioning work, to properly manage the working hours of the people doing the job. Back in 1988, the disastrous collision at Clapham Junction happened in part because working for weeks on end without any days off was part of the culture in some areas of the railway. The events at Cardiff showed how easy it is to forget the lessons of Clapham and slip back into those habits under the time pressures of a big commissioning. One can only agree. But there's more. A few months later, in August 2017, a train departed Waterloo on a green aspect but was rerouted and collided with an engineer's train on the adjacent line. Luckily, the driver saw the way the points were set and managed to brake, meaning that the collision occurred at low speed and resulted in no injuries. Modification to the wiring of the point detection circuits meant that a desk set up to aid testing no longer simulated the detection of the points in question correctly, because it hadn't been modified to account for the detection circuit mods. On the weekend of the 12th and 13th of August 2017, while trains had been stopped from running on the lines leading to the points, a temporary wiring mod was made in the relay room in a bid to restore the correct operation of the relevant switch on the test desk. But the mod wasn't reviewed by a signalling designer and was wrongly left in place when the railway was returned to operation on the morning of the 14th of August. Well, I don't know about you, but we could quote Mr. French again, couldn't we? We could quote Mr. Hidden again too. I'm afraid that chap at the bottom there is meant to be me before the midlife crisis hair. If you're an older member of the audience, think of it more as Graham Garden. We can say that we combat complacency with continued vigilance. We can say that corporate memory exists only while we remember it. And we have a generation of railway people coming up who will not have lived through Clapham, or indeed Southall, Ladbroke Grove, Hatfield, Ufton, Potter's Bar. In time that will include Carmont as well. I like to think that presentations like this help with that, but more importantly, Volcarail has recently produced a working simulation of the Clapham wiring and what happened to it on that fateful day in December 1988. And Andy Stringer, the chief engineer at Siemens of Chippenham, has built an exact replica of the wiring model that the hidden inquiry was shown during that inquiry, and you can have a go on it, and I have had a go on it. You can make that fateful clunk, you can make the wrong side failure happen, if you like, and you can know that that's why a small girl had a birthday party without her father, because he was killed in the accident. It's a chilling thing to do, but it really does bring home the importance of remembering that accident. We've also started including at RSSB more corporate memory stories and information in our Red series of films than hitherto. And we're including that in the risk packs that we present to the cross-industry risk groups, like People on Trains and in Stations Risk Group, Asset Integrity Group, and so on. We can talk about railways being whole systems, and that's something we don't always seem to consider when the work of one sector cuts across that of another. Everyone needs to understand how their action or inaction can affect safety, and that's from senior managers to people insulating wires, tightening fasteners, actually doing the work. At the same time, I think we need to be aware that what was a risk in 1988 may not be one in 2023 or 2033, as our reliance on digital technology grows and puts a correspondingly greater emphasis on software integrity and cybersecurity, and we're continuing to throw ever more eggs into that particular basket. In short, it's all about understanding and managing risk. Hidden suggested BR had become almost blind to the risk from wrong side failures, contrasting it with its focus on SPAD risk. And BR was probably right to put proportionately more focus on SPAD risk. Purley and Belgrove do attest to that, but not to the exclusion of wrong side failures or any other hazard come to that. Of course, it's totally rational to put the most risk reduction effort into areas where the risk is highest or where there's the most scope for risk reduction. But we do, I think, have to keep our risk assessments fresh, and that means looking regularly at what we do, the risks from doing it, and how to do it safely. We also need to remember, I think, that low risk doesn't mean no accidents, just as no accident doesn't always mean low risk. We all know that we can increase the accuracy of our risk picture by collecting, analysing and learning from information, not just about accidents, but also their precursors and activities that prevent them. Hidden was damning about BR's failure to collect information on wrong side failures systematically. But after Clapham, it tightened up its safety arm and centralised recording by bringing together previously disparate sets of information into BRIMS, the forerunner of today's SMIS. The latter replaced the former soon after privatisation and is now constantly being upgraded, renewed, fettled to try to really enable us to drill down into the information that we need to drill down into. But anyone who's heard me speak in other fora before will know that whilst data is highly important, it isn't everything. And we have a small number of data points that appear to be increasing in the Clapham space. You'll know about the Dalwhinnie incident, which was another wrong side wiring failure that led to the derailment of a HST formation. The tester who erred in that particular case, rather like the tester at Clapham, was fatigued. There were issues that person's manager knew about. But I think, reading between the lines and from what I know from discussing with RAIB, I believe that person also was suffering from long COVID. That suggests to me, because we still don't really know what the long-term effects of long COVID are going to be, that the nature of fatigue itself may change or may be changing over time. So that's something we need to be mindful of. And more recently still, South Wingfield happened. 2 in a bed. A wrong side failure that led to 2 trains in the same signal section. The closest, perhaps the closest we've come to Clapham since Clapham. And you will see from the report, which I highly recommend you to read, the South Wingfield report from RAIB, point is made. You can draw a line from South Wingfield back through Dalwhinnie, back through Cardiff East, back through Waterloo to Clapham. It's a slightly growing number of data points. And rather disturbingly, the maintenance and testing handbooks that I referred to a few minutes ago, which came about after Clapham as a result of to try to stop that kind of thing happening again, were not briefed out by Network Rail to its contractors. Yes, to Network Rail's own staff, very good and all well, but not to the entire community that needed to know that material. And that's quite a disturbing development. This alone, I think, suggests the continuing relevance of Clapham as a corporate memory story. So that's the end of part one, if you like. I'm now going to go on to the second story, which you can see that's my brain whirring in the middle there quite slowly, and now it's stopped altogether. No surprises there. We're going to talk about Hatfield, which occurred in 2000. And I'm going to start by asking you a question. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the music. Doesn't matter too much if you can't. But can anybody remember this?
Travelling by rail hasn't been easy recently, for any of us. But now all Britain's rail companies are pulling together, doing whatever it takes to return you to a national rail network you can depend on. Returning you to fast and frequent services. Returning you to comfort. Returning you to business. The National Rail Network. It's time to return.
If you don't remember it, that was a television advertisement shown in 2001 when the blanket speed restrictions imposed after the Hatfield derailment were being lifted. It was meant to show an optimism, a return to business as usual as speeds climbed and journey times shrank once more. Henceforth, the long-distance commuter could go back to work, nieces in Durham could visit aunts in Doncaster, nephews in Morpeth could see uncles in York, and all kinds of traveller could make all kinds of journey without leave, let, or hindrance. All kinds of traveller, that is, except the 4 who'd been killed in the accident. It was the new millennium. It was October the 17th. The day began ordinarily enough, as days like this often do. The crew had worked empty to Skipton, back to King's Cross, and then took a short break. Their next train was 1 Delta 38, the 1210 King's Cross Leeds, which left the capital right time and snaked over the points at the station throat before entering the dark cavern of Gasworks Tunnel. Hauled by 91023, followed by a retinue of Mark IV stock, it represented in many ways the last hurrah of British Rail's intercity brand, flying now under the new colours of Great North Eastern, an operator aware of, proud of the fact that it worked the route of the Flying Scotsman. The speed of the thoroughbred rose as the train passed Alexandra Palace, Oakley Park and Hadley Wood. By 12:23 it was rounding the Welham curve at about 115 miles an hour. After passing under the Oxleys Avenue overbridge, the driver and the trainee sitting at the controls noticed that the brake pipe pressure had fallen to 0, initiating a full brake application. What on earth had happened? The reason soon became apparent. Derailment. Though the 91 and the first 2 carriages stayed on the track, the remaining 8 had come off. Some remained upright, others were leaning over. One, the buffet car, had struck OLE stanchion Kilo 563, bringing it down before overturning and striking 2 masts more, the second of which penetrated the carriage from roof to floor. It was here that the 4 fatalities occurred. Over 70 people were also injured, 4 of them seriously, including 2 members of staff. Both driver and guard immediately raised the alarm while their colleagues took steps to protect the train from collision and ensure the traction supply was off. On board, one buffet car passenger, obviously suffering from shock, turned to a member of the crew. "So is this train still going to Leeds then?" he asked. "No, sir," came the reply. "I don't think it is." The first emergency service staff had arrived within 10 minutes. Fire and ambulance crews helped BTP and their local colleagues evacuate and escort passengers to safety. 4 HSE inspectors soon appeared, but because no one knew at this stage if the cause was a bomb or a broken axle, their initial examination was delayed until 7 that evening. By this time, BTP had declared the site a crime scene. It would remain under strict control until 2:30 on Saturday the 21st of October, after detailed searches of the area and the vehicles had been completed. 21 investigators were eventually involved, including specialists in rail and general engineering. They revealed neither bomb nor broken axle, but found that the high rail of the canted curve at Welham had broken into 300 pieces. Beyond this, the rail was intact, though displaced for about 44 metres, but there was a further fragmented length of 54 metres beyond that. Marks on the wheels of the 91 suggested it may have passed over a fracture, after which the rail shattered beneath the first two carriages. The HSE closed the East Coast Main Line for 3 weeks to undertake a forensic fingertip search. Critics thought it added precious little to what had been learned during the first few hours, which had already sparked concern within Railtrack about the rail condition elsewhere on the network, sparked too the blanket imposition of all those speed restrictions, many for 20 miles an hour. Alistair Morton, and there he is, chairman of the Strategic Rail Authority back then, was moved to declare the whole thing, quote unquote, an institutional nervous breakdown. Throughout its life, track will deteriorate with use. This was true at the opening of the Stockton and Darlington in 1825. It was true at Hatfield. It's true now. In this, the old BTF film, Elizabethan Express, track maintenance gangs are shown as part of the huge team that made railways work, from the train planners to the waiters, the upholsterers to the fitters. The track gangs are, of course, if you know the film, the ones responsible for allowing passengers riding in clover to take meals on velvet at 90 or over, as the film's rhyming couplet commentary had it. And there's Stan with his big hammer. Stan's latter-day equivalent, of course, were Railtrack as infrastructure controller, Balfour, which had a contract to maintain the track and signalling on the East Coast Main Line, and Jarvis, which had the contract for rail renewals back in 2000. The railway's ribbons of steel suffer more when trains have wheels with flat sections and when there's poor jointing and poor packing under the rail. This heightens fatigue, which can lead to cracks or fractures if not detected. In some cases, cracks develop deep and downward in a way that weakens the rail. Those near the gauge corner became known as GCC, gauge corner cracks. The Hatfield investigations, there were more than one of them, explained how GCC had first been noticed in the early days of diesel traction, when heavily laden wheel sets revolving at higher speeds than hitherto were found to flake the railheads. Instances were few at first, but started to become more frequent on the West Coast Main Line in the 80s, partly as a result of the high attractive effort exerted by electric locos. This led to a series of reports in the 90s, started by BR and taken forward by Railtrack, which showed GCC to be playing an increasing role in broken rail incidents. The higher rail on super elevated curves was the most vulnerable due to the higher contact stresses at the wheel-rail interface there. Though the accident seemed to come out of nowhere, the downfast at Welham already fitted the cant and curve profile. The high attractive effort and higher speed parts of the equation joined when electrification came to the East Coast Main Line in the late 1980s. Viewed in retrospect, then, it's perhaps obvious that there was going to be a problem here. But though causal chains are always obvious when viewed from the accident back to their origin, it's fair to say that the key players were blind to the problem in part because they lacked knowledge. There was indeed an incomplete appreciation of the risks presented by gauge corner cracking and a consequent failure to develop and disseminate comprehensive instructions on its identification and the control measures required. A full appreciation of the risks would probably have led to the rail being renewed. The last complete renewal in the Welham Hatfield area had come under BR in 1982 using normal grade steel rail. As the decade wore on, though, so did the rail. In fact, the downfast at Welham was found to be suffering from GCC in 1993, which is why 2 years later it was replaced with a continuously welded flat-bottomed rail, which had been treated in a bid to improve its resistance to wear. Unfortunately, the fact that harder rails wear more slowly not only allows cracks to develop, it also takes longer for the rail profile to conform to the wheel profile, resulting in a smaller contact area and even higher contact stresses. A problem, but less of a problem perhaps if rails are regularly checked. There were, and are, two ways, to my knowledge, to check the integrity of a rail: by eye and by ultrasonic testing. The latter took off in 1970 when handheld equipment was augmented by a two-car DMU fitted out to do the same job at 20 miles an hour. That's not it, by the way. I think it was a Derby lightweight initially. By the end of the century, this had become a vital tool in the battle against broken rails. At Hatfield, that battle was lost, though the fight was never going to be easy, as GCC could be very hard to detect. In some respects, it was similar to an internal kidney-shaped fatigue crack on the right there, known, I hope, as a Tâche ovale defect. However, GCC differed from a tar cheval in that the latter could be picked up by regular ultrasonic testing techniques, whereas the former could propagate at a different angle, allowing it to evade the probe. To combat this, in March 1995, new testing procedures were proposed, known as U14, in which the probe was offset towards the gauge corner. This allowed it to detect major fatigue cracks emanating from that corner. And once a crack was found, the U3 procedure, in which the probe is placed over the centre line of the rail, would be used to confirm it and provide an estimation of severity. Unfortunately, while the U3 examinations at Welham Green were being made at the required frequencies, the additional U14 testing was not, meaning that the full picture of the situation was blurred, meaning too that further renewal was not considered. In September 2000, though, a fourth player, Serco Rail Test, did undertake grinding in the area. And grinding smooths the top of the rail and can stop small cracks spreading further into it. All it did in this case, though, was smooth the gauge corner and take out all the loose chippings along the edge. This had no impact whatsoever on the effectiveness of the U3 testing, which registered total loss of rail bottom and rail untestable 4 times before the accident. That in itself was in fact a warning, however. As to the actual process of grinding, the cracks were now so deep it probably only served to weaken the rail even more. Elsewhere on the network, GCC had been appearing in the causal chains of a growing number of broken rail incidents, and to be fair, Railtrack was far from oblivious. Back in November 1999, it had told Balfour to list the places where GCC was present on high-speed, high-canted track. Then, later that month, multiple GCC defects resulted in a serious rail break on a high rail at Aycliffe. It was on the East Coast Main Line. It was another alarm bell. Balfour's list, delivered in December, identified several priority sites. Some of the worst were in the Hatfield and Welham area and were deemed to require renewal within a month. A temporary speed restriction should have been imposed at this point to ease pressure on the rail, but it wasn't. By the end of March 2000, however, the condition of the track had deteriorated enough for replacement to be brought forward to the 3rd week in April. Alas, the requisite rail was not delivered until April the 28th, after 3 failed attempts to do so. Overrunning work at Hatfield caused more delay, pushing the work back until a new application was made for various dates up to January the 28th, 2001. What looks now, perhaps, like so much incompetence or misfortune had been partly motivated by concerns about delays, which drained money from Railtrack in performance costs. The figures here tell the story. On October the 9th, 8 days before the accident, the company had reported that in the first half of 2000-2001, delay minutes had risen 10% year on year. This effectively wiped out the 10% improvement of 99-2000 towards the regulator's 12.7% target. Yet all the while, the renewal was delayed. All the while, the ultrasonic warnings went unheeded. Their cracks continued to develop. When interviewed, the patrollers said they inspected 2 lines in each patrol, but their reports indicated that all 4 lines were being inspected during one session, which of course they were. It was a question of resourcing. At privatisation, Railtrack and its contractors had been obliged to cut costs by 3%. This saw patrol teams of 4 or 6 reduced to 2, a patroller and a single lookout. With just 1 lookout at Welham, where trains can pass at 100 miles an hour or more, it was far too dangerous to do anything other than check the curve from the cess. One patroller said he was able to see the high rail from this position, but only the back of the head and not the actual gauge corner. Maybe so, but there was evidence that deep cracks at Welham, or at least those likely to lead to failure, were linked to surface spalling, and spalling was found to be present over a distance of at least 1,000 metres south of the derailment zone. The patrols didn't spot this. If it was a question of resourcing, though, it was also a question of training. The fact that none of the patrols' reports referred to anything to do with rolling contact fatigue, GCC, was because they hadn't been properly trained to identify it. More worryingly, the last patroller to inspect the Welham Green curve before the accident told railway safeties investigators that he'd never been trained to recognise GCC or understand what risks it brought with it. But of course, Hatfield wasn't just about patrols, it was about management too. And the track walk inspections undertaken by Balfour's route section managers were deficient. They were also infrequent. Evidence showed that between May 1997 and October 2000, they were well below Balfour's mandated 2-monthly intervals. Another Balfour instruction stated that a manager should ride in the cab of a train every 2 months to inspect conditions. Between October 1997 and the day of the derailment, only 8 of a possible 18 rides had been made. There was also a culture of inspecting on the basis of visual examination alone. Behind this were failures in the management of defects and a failure to provide a safe system of work to allow staff to carry out effective inspections. Such difficulties were not communicated to management, on top of which resource shortages and staff turnover resulted in the absence of knowledgeable and experienced staff. And you can see how all of that works up into Reason's classic Swiss cheese model there. In interview, Railtrack's L&E Compliance and Engineering Manager said he was unable to follow a discussion of track work at Hitchin because he didn't understand it. In interview, the Zone Quality Standards Manager said he had neither knowledge of railway engineering nor railway safety. If nothing else, this explains why the audit process applied to Balfour was ineffective and why in particular there was an overemphasis on assessing documentary compliance and not the quality of the actual work. Think of the Nimrod disaster and the Haddon Cave report on that tick box mentality. That's something like I think we had here. With most big process accidents, there's often someone putting all the pieces together, sensing what's coming, but to no avail. For Ladbroke Grove, that person had been Alison Forster, First Great Western's then Operations and Safety Director. For Hatfield, it was David Ventry, the professional head of track at Railtrack HQ. In the 2 years leading up to the derailment, the maintenance, performance, rail brakes and management of GCC had formed a large part of Ventry's workload. It was a part that worried him. In May 1999, he told senior colleagues that a key driver in the rise in the number of broken rails is poor maintenance, or more precisely, the lack of adequate and appropriate maintenance. Informed by a track walk, he wrote to his superiors in November, expressing his belief that the current state of track on parts of our network was heading towards the boundary of acceptability, clarifying later that there was widespread non-compliance with track maintenance standards and good practice. More tellingly, the balance between commercial drivers and safety was overwhelmingly towards the commercial, so much so that zone track engineers are in fear, he wrote, of losing their jobs if they do not accept non-compliance. He had a point. Broken rails have been on the up since privatisation. The HSE's Railway Safety Statistics Bulletin had reported a 21% rise from 755 in 97-98 to 937 in 98-99. Tom Windsor, who'd become the rail regulator when that role was embodied in one person, had become that role in July 1999, was concerned that the company was breaching its network licence conditions. He wrote to Railtrack on August the 12th, demanding more clarity on what it deemed acceptable. Railtrack's Safety and Standards Directorate audit report for 1999 showed that part of the problem may have been the new Project Destiny strategy. Devised by management consultants McKinsey, this focused on the idea of replacing assets only when necessary and not at fixed time intervals. To do this successfully, one needs excellent knowledge of one's asset condition. Railtrack had no such thing. As the audit report said, the just-in-time approach led to major shifts from track renewals to maintenance. Part of the problem had been that within Railtrack there was no one system that allowed the company to view the total number and types of defects affecting the track at any one time. Railtrack's asset database was incomplete and inaccurate, which meant they had little idea about what assets they had, their condition and expected life expiry. Instead, they relied on information from contractors, all of whom used different systems. Part of the problem too was the depression of the professional engineering role within Railtrack HQ and L&E zone levels, quote unquote. But it wasn't just the one zone, of course. It was in fact an early policy of Railtrack to get rid of anyone with engineering experience in the belief that outsourcing was best. This left Railtrack's engineering seem paper thin, which was not going to be helpful to Ventry, who had neither the authority nor the resource, therefore, to bring about the improvements he felt were necessary. It is clear, wrote the ORR, that Ventry alerted senior colleagues to the non-compliant state of rail maintenance. However, Railtrack as an organisation failed to implement and monitor his advice to ensure rails were properly maintained. Over at zone level, from early 1998, Zone Director Nick Pollard was in discussion with Balfour about broken rails on the East Coast Main Line, linking them to poor quality maintenance and non-compliance. In January 1999, he expressed concern that the number of broken rails had increased and asked for the reasons to be investigated. In May 2000, he wrote to Balfour, noting that it was very clear from recent events that it was not providing resources adequate to tasks and scope of the maintenance contract. It was too little, too late. If Hatfield showed nothing else, it showed perhaps the consequence of cutting corners. The irony is that the route to improvement had already been set, for the HSE and Windsor had already commissioned the Transport Technology Centre to investigate broken rails and Railtrack's management of them. The report was published that November, 1 month after the accident. It, and of course Hatfield itself, led to the establishment of a task force to research metallurgy, wheel-rail interaction, brakes, suspension and ultrasonic rail floor detection, the fruits of which were borne in subsequent years. Yet they were fruits that would not be enjoyed by Railtrack itself. As we saw at the beginning of this second story, the immediate operational impact of the accident had been enormous, but it was also expensive, as the rail maintenance and replacement bill combined with the escalating cost of the concurrent West Coast mainline upgrade and the fact that the ORR's first review of Railtrack had not awarded it enough money to run the business. In 2001, the government grew tired of the spiralling bill, and on the order of the then Transport Secretary Stephen Byers, the company went into administration. The High Court allowed it to be taken out again in 2002 so that Network Rail could take over. In 2003, 6 members of staff were charged with the manslaughter of the 4 people killed in the accident. Giving evidence, Ventry told the court that if the standards had been followed, the crash would not have occurred. 2 years later, however, Network Rail took maintenance contracts in-house, which led to a more strategic approach to infrastructure management. Changes to legislation were also underway. At the end of 2000, the safety case regulations had come into force, replacing the 1994 version and requiring any infrastructure controller, train operator or station operator to prepare a safety case, a key element of which was an SMS, a safety management system. 6 years later came ROGs, which were intended to bring Britain's railway in line with the European Rail Safety Directive, and meant that infrastructure managers and train operators had to apply to the ORR for a safety certificate, safety authorisation, or, where appropriate, both of those things. By this time, the Rail Accident Investigation Branch had been established, thereby closing a recommendation from the Cullen Inquiry into Ladbroke Grove and setting up the mechanism we know today for improving our learning capabilities. And railway safety morphed into RSSB, which we like to think not only led to improvements in safety performance and risk analysis, but also the establishment of systems interface committees. 1 SIC, as you can see, deals with the vehicle track interface, which includes rolling contact, fatigue and adhesion, issues that were particularly relevant to Hatfield. This process and all the research it spawned meant that things got better. Thanks to Hatfield, indeed, the industry now has a much better understanding of rail failure modes and how to manage them more effectively. Technology too has improved, plain line pattern recognition and eddy current testing, for example, allowing a much more accurate picture of rail condition to be captured. Network Rail has also introduced a number of predictive tools and programs to identify precursor events, while the installation of gotcha lineside equipment detects real-time wheel imbalance and impact loads on the rail, which allows vehicles with these defects to be stopped, thereby reducing damage to the track. Thanks to these measures, broken rails have fallen from a 40-year average of about 750 a year to an 8-year average of something more like 150. Yet despite attention turning to the digital railway, as I alluded to earlier, and the vagaries of software integrity, not without reason, as RAIB's report on the Cambrian incidents attests, trains do still run on rails, as I think Roger Ford pointed out. Bolt this to the fact that the demographic of rail management is getting ever younger, and it's clear, I think, that the lessons of Hatfield and Clapham will need to be carried forward for some years to come. End presentation this evening. Sorry about the slightly inappropriate music there. I'll come back into the room now and unshare. I hope you found that interesting and useful, and I'll very happily take any questions you might have, but thank you for listening.
That's great, thank you, Greg. So who do we have for questions? I saw a hand raised briefly then, but it disappeared. Kevin, got a question?
Hello, Kevin.
No, sorry, it wasn't a question. It was an acknowledged thank you there, Greg. Useful run through.
Oh,
It was
well,
meant to
thank
be
you.
a round of applause.
Thank you very much indeed. Very kind of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Russell.
Hi, Russell.
I was going to say, if anyone doesn't want to speak, please just type your comments in the chat and I'll read them out.
I was just wondering, is there anywhere documented on what is good practice in retaining corporate memory?
It's something we're trying to work on, Russell, at RFSB right now, actually. Unfortunately, I think it's sort of in the eye of the beholder a little bit. Safety is in the eye of the duty holder, if you like. We are putting it, as I mentioned, in more of our red safety briefing films. We're putting it in our risk packs. Those who look after the safety risk model, which is the sort of the bedrock of a lot of our safety and performance analysis, are also factoring corporate memory lessons into that work as well. But the problem is that it's a very human thing. In Japan, they have a museum which actually has carriages from accidents in the state that they ended up in that accident. And they kind of use that as a corporate memory aid. But they also use a lot of people who may now be retired, who were there at the time, so to speak. Now, in our industry, in this country, we have a lot of people still in the industry who remember these incidents. What I usually recommend to companies is that people with long rail careers are factored into projects, particularly kick-off meetings. But you can, there is never any wrong time to talk to somebody. I work with a fellow called Michael Woods, and who started on railway in 1973, various roles. He's with RSSB now in the research department. And he said a very interesting but very human thing. And it was simply that I can't remember what I can remember until you talk to me. So it's the actual conversation with another human being that will jog the memory, and he can then bring the lesson forward. Now, we do that a lot at RSSB. You could argue that we're quite a rarefied body for having those kinds of conversations, but it is always worth talking. I think it should be part of induction as well, to be honest, Russell. I was speaking to a young person from Network Rail this morning about this sort of thing, because she had been advised to come to me to get some lessons. I recommended Red for Danger by Rolt to her. Thankfully, she'd already got one. But that kind of human passing on of the flower of safety, as Rolt put it, quoting Shakespeare, is something I do advocate. I'm sure in time AI will come to our aid on a lot of this. I hope I've retired myself by then, but I do advocate plugging older railway brains into your project workings, because it's about we have to give and take. We have to pay credence to what went before, but we also know where to draw the line, because not all lessons we learned in the past are going to have relevance for us going forward. But I think South Wingfield and Dalwhinnie show, at least in the Clapham scenario, what can happen or come close to happening when we don't talk about these things, include them in training, include them in induction. Sorry, that was a bit waffly, but I hope there was some sense in that for you. There isn't anything hard and fast. It is very much in the kind of the gift of the individual companies at the minute, but that's how I advocate it anyway.
Yes, it's given me food for thought. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for asking that one.
Just to add to that, I recently had the privilege of going to Cranfield University for a day, where they've got one of the coaches from the Grey Rig accident,
Right.
and that's preserved in the States. There's, ballast inside it, seats dislodged. I don't know how people would get access to that, but it's there. Maybe contact university or something.
Yeah, that
want to go and see.
That would bring it home to a lot of people. I think we have to be careful. That's actually the witnessing of traumatic events, funnily enough, is something that we're thinking about at RSSB at the moment. And we do a lot of work with helping members of staff who have witnessed, past tense. How good are we at preparing new members of staff for what they may witness? And there's a fine balance to be struck between frightening, quote unquote, for want of a better word, somebody who's just joined us, but being honest about what you may have to deal with at some point in your career. And that might be a good way of doing it. Presentations like mine are two-dimensional, aren't they? They can only ever, read as well, can only ever go some distance. So yes, I mean, that rather follows the Japanese model, doesn't it? With the museum that they have. So yeah, that's a good call, Liam.
So do we have any other questions? I'm sure there must be a few.
If anybody incidentally thinks of anything after I've gone, so to speak, through Liam, and I'm sure he won't mind, you can drop me a line, and I will answer everyone's questions as quickly as I'm able to.
Actually, Kevin just posted it in the chat. Could or should RSSB curate or host a learning legacy system, such as is in place for HS1 and Crossrail?
Yeah, I think that's a good shout. At the minute, the corporate memory function of RSSB is quite under-resourced, i.e. you're looking at it. But it is something I think we should do an awful lot more work on. What may help me is that I believe Robin Gisby, who heads up the operator of last resort, is very keen on corporate memory retention, and we're getting a lot of those sorts of messages. I've just had it from yourself, but from our members, various operators. So yes, the time must surely come, and it surely must be a body like RSSB that does that. Or assists RAIB in that, but we have to be involved in it. I would have thought.
Just a plug for RAIB. All our reports are on the internet. If you Google RAIB and a particular word or phrase, you can often find.
And I'll add to that, on your website, you have some very useful specific learning documents as well, don't you, which group some of the reports together into themes, which we also find useful at RSSB as well.
Sorry, plug for RAIB there.
And rightly so, Liam, rightly so.
Excuse me. So, any other questions, or shall we wrap it up there? Okay, well, Greg, thank you very much for giving up your evening and giving us what was a fantastic presentation there. Yeah, really introduction to some of the key accidents of our past and the reports and how they've changed things and regulations and initiatives to improve the railways. And again, a bit of good Q&A at the end there. So I'd like to ask if people could turn the microphones on and join me in a round of applause, thanking Greg for his time this evening.
Thank you very much, Liam, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for listening to me. If you do think of anything, my inbox is always open, as they say, and if I don't know the answer, I probably work with somebody who does know the answer, so we'll get you that information should you need it. So thanks very much indeed. I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye now. Have a great one.